We as marketers generally, and creative people especially, tend to look down our nose at the sales function or sales profession. You might even speak of it so highly. And I think that's because we misunderstand it. We all know what it's like to be on the buying side of a bad selling experience. And I think most of us are scarred by that experience.
Hey Hatchlings, welcome to the Motion Hatch podcast. I'm your host, Hayley Akins. Hey Hatchlings, thank you so much for joining me for the Motion Hatch podcast. Today I have Blair Enns on the show. He wrote a book called Win Without Pitching and also has a book out called Pricing Creativity. We talked a lot today about pricing, which was really cool. We talked about the ins and outs of value-based pricing and how it might apply to motion design. We chatted about how to sell your services and also charge more. And we spoke a bit about niching down and becoming an expert. So there's a ton of great stuff in this episode for you. So let's get into it. Hey Blair, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Hayley. I'm happy to be here.
So at Motion Hatch, our mission is to help motion designers do better business. So it seemed perfectly aligned to get you on the show since your focus is around helping creatives charge more and things like that. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and how you got into doing this kind of work?
Sure. I'm the founder and CEO of Win Without Pitching, which is a sales training organization. And don't leave when I use the S word. Creative people don't like to hear that. But we're a sales training organization for creative professionals. The truth is we're more than sales training. And I lean into the S word, which a lot of my audience finds to be a dirty word. They would prefer new business development, but I think we need to tell it like it is. So we're a sales training organization for creative professionals. We run public workshops, we do private on-site workshops, and we do remote training. And I've been doing this since 2002. I'm based in a remote mountain village in rural British Columbia, Canada.
Yeah, so it's really awesome. I love that you're bringing up the sales word, talk about selling already.
Yeah.
Because I really like that. And I think that we need to talk about it more and, just talk about money more in general, really. And I think that my audience also thinks that it's a little bit of a dirty word. So they're like, oh, we don't want to sell. We just want to make cool animations, So I think it's really funny.
Yeah, I grew up professionally in the ad agency world first and then in the design firm world. And in both places, we always shied away from the S word. I was hired as an account manager in an ad agency when I was 22 years old. And a few months into my first job, my boss said to me, "Hey, you seem to be pretty fearless. I'm going to put you in charge of new business." I was 22 years old. I was in charge of new business for this agency. And people would say, "What do you do?" And I would say, "Oh, I do new business." "Oh, you mean sales?" No. It's not sales. It's a lot more sophisticated than sales. We as marketers generally, and creative people especially, tend to look down our nose at the sales function or sales profession. You might even speak of it so highly. And I think that's because we misunderstand it. We all know what it's like to be on the buying side of a bad selling experience. And I think most of us are scarred by that experience. So when we start our business, and we start the business because we love the craft of the business, and then we realize, oh, now I've got to sell this. We have to embrace this dirty word, and we have to find some way to be comfortable with it. So it's a big kind of theme that permeates the creative professions, especially like audiences like yours, where it tends to be independent freelancers or people running really small studios. We really have to come to grips with this dirty little word.
A lot of people that I talk to, they don't really know how to sell themselves or the work that they're doing. So how would you recommend that someone kind of start on this path, and how can we kind of change our mindset, a little bit to be we're freelancers, but we're also business owners as well, I guess.
My point of view on this, it will resonate with some people, and some people it won't resonate with a lot. Like a really high drive, somebody who has a high competitive drive, rejection proof, what you might think of as a classical salesperson, might not agree with this point of view. But my advice to people would be, do not look at selling as the act of talking people into things. I really don't think it's your job to convince anybody of anything ever. I think it's your job to carve out a business that creates value in the world, that's kind of a nice niche little business where you can confidently see that you are better at some things than other people, and then go in pursuit of really good fit clients. Go looking for people that you can help, and understand that selling at the highest level really is just facilitating. It's one expert looking for somebody or some organization that they can help, and you're just facilitating the choice. And if you are the right choice, fantastic. And if you're not the right choice, you shouldn't be trying to talk anybody into things. And some, like classical salespeople, might just cringe at that definition, but that's one that works for me, and that's one that works for a lot of the creative professionals that I work with.
That makes sense to me. I think because you talk about in your book a lot about expertise and how if you more of an expert than a generalist, you can, more easily dictate pricing and terms and things like that. I just wondered whether you thought that motion design, like that industry, was niche enough, or you think that people should be like, motion designers who do work particularly like for YouTubers or doctors, or do you see what I mean? Like there's a lot of questions around like niching down, and I think that you've spoken before about niching down via like discipline or market and stuff like that. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that kind of side of things.
When you're thinking of positioning your firm, the first step is focus. You have to focus on something. And the reason you focus on something is so that you can build a deeper expertise. And that's really the only meaningful way of separating yourself from your vast hordes of competitors. So we narrow our focus so that we might solve the same types of problems over and over again. We can benefit from pattern matching. And this comes from my friend David Baker, who talks about this a lot. When you're looking at a whole bunch of different things all the time, you're kind of this distracted creative person who's like interested in everything. It's hard to see the patterns, but as soon as you narrow your field of vision and start observing the same problems or situations over and over again, then you benefit from pattern matching, and you also benefit from repeated application. When you start solving the same problems over and over again, you kind of know what to do. And to a creative person, that might sound kind of boring. It's not as boring as it sounds. It's just the fear that you have to get over. That's why you need to narrow your focus. The typical creative firm tends to be too broadly focused because creative people are drawn to variety. So when you're thinking about, well, how do I think about focus? You think about it in two dimensions, the dimensions of discipline. So what is it that you do? And market, for whom do you do it? And that's really the first step. You need to define your discipline and your market. So you kind of think, well, I'll narrow this like the discipline would be motion design. The market initially would be for anybody who needs motion design. And as you said, the market might be YouTubers or doctors who have YouTube channels or something. And those might be good decisions and they might be bad decisions. You really have to play with all of these variables and try on these different ideas. So to your question, is motion design niche enough? Probably not. It really depends on kind of your geographical market. The challenge with video is the tools, as you know, are democratized. Everybody's got them in their pocket. The motion design aspect, the art aspect of everything beyond shooting, they're less commodified or democratized than the actual shooting and perhaps editing. But they still suffer from the same problem. The tools are in the hands of so many people who think they can do it themselves. So I think we're probably at a time where just motion design for a lot of people starting out might not be good enough, might not be narrow enough.
I was thinking that maybe it would be good to niche down in, you could niche down into like character-based animation or a particular style or something like that. And then maybe you wouldn't have to niche into a market as well. But if you're just going to do lots of different styles of motion design, maybe looking at a particular market would be a good idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I probably don't know enough about the space to be able to say, well, these markets make sense, these markets don't make sense. In my first book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, it's got 12 proclamations. It's like a 12-step program. And the first one is we will specialize. And we've been discussing that. But you do have to be careful that you don't create this like artificially narrow specialization that where it kind of looks meaningfully different. It's narrow, but it's not really meaningfully different. If you're going to pick a market like doctors, you need to know something about that market. You need to have some depth of knowledge about that market. And what is it? around doctors' needs for motion design would we understand, or is there to understand that others wouldn't understand? Can we build some meaningful expertise that would be difficult for others to replicate? And in doctors, maybe verticals isn't the way to go when defining your market. Maybe it is. I don't know.
What you were saying there is a bit like what I've done with this podcast and my business is, I was really interested in business and entrepreneurship and that kind of thing, but also motion design. And I've kind of managed to cross the two, which, obviously not many people in our industry have done that. So that's why it sort of stood out, I guess. So, but I understand what you're saying, whereas like taking a pen and going, yeah, I'm going to serve doctors now or dentists or like something like that, that seems a bit like you need to have some sort of interest or some sort of unique positioning or skill that allows you to kind of maybe cross into some of these different markets.
You do. And are you still a practicing motion designer?
I'm working fully on Motion Hatch at the moment, but I would still go back into it if I wanted to. I'm kind of feel like in my mind that this is what is giving me the most kind of happiness at the moment and helping the most people. So that's why I continue to go down this path rather than keep going down other paths that I previously have, like trying to work more for companies that have a positive impact on the world and do animations for them and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And those, when you start to define your markets like that, we're running a positioning boot camp right now. We're right in the middle. So it's a 6-week online training program. I don't run it, but I sat in on one of the AMAs yesterday. And so I had a conversation with almost 20 different owners of independent creative firms that are trying to position themselves. And that theme comes up a lot of like, if we need to narrow, let's think about narrowing the market to organizations that want to make the world a better place. That's a commonly held idea that a lot of creative people would like to do, but it's really hard to pull off for a variety of reasons. So when you start to think of how you're going to narrow your focus, there's some really obvious ones that come up like that, like purpose-built brands or brands that have a sense of purpose or social change or et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know that that's actually a meaningful distinction to the client. And it kind of begs a bigger question about, I actually think that market of companies that are trying to do good beyond just profit is a lot bigger than people think it is. In fact, I think it's the norm. I think it's so big that it's not a meaningful distinction. Some people might disagree with me, but these are all of the questions that you have to go through when you're trying on your focus. Before I forget, I wanted to make another point about cautioning people when they're trying on their specialization, because I think your audience might be a little bit younger or earlier in their career. You have to be careful about specializing too early. Early in your career, you should be seeking breadth. What that means is, what I say to my kids is 2 things. Work really hard, say yes to everything. That's how you should view the first part of your career. Work really hard and say yes to everything. And by saying yes to everything, you will end up doing a wide variety of work. And it might not be really highly paid work because you're not going to be seen as a specialist, but you will gain so much experience and you will start to see some broad patterns and you will start to see where the opportunities are coming to you in one space and not another. You'll start to see maybe some hints of where you might specialize in the future or how you might combine either 2 different markets or more likely 2 different disciplines or skill sets into something that's a little bit novel. My book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, has been out there for about 10 years, and I'm not alone in preaching the specialization message. But I think all of us who have been preaching that message, we need to be conscious of the fact that when creative folks are early in their career, if you just skip the working for somebody thing, which is very admirable, and just go into freelancing and starting your own business right away, it might be a bit of a dangerous thing to take this advice right at the beginning of your career and specialize. You really do need to begin with the breadth of expertise of sampling all kinds of different things.
It's definitely hard for people. So when normally what happens is, you work for a company for a few years and then you're like, now I'm ready to go freelance and stuff like that. And then you're trying to get clients from everywhere. And then people tend to start thinking, well, maybe I want to start a studio and that kind of thing. Where do you see this specialization on this path, if that makes sense? Is it like towards the end of the freelancer journey, more into the studio one? Or do you think that we could be more specialist as freelancers?
I think if you decide that you want to be a freelancer for a long time, and you could it's possible to build a lucrative career as a freelancer. Absolutely, you would consider specializing at some point as a freelancer. You would have to. And you would find as a freelancer anyway, the market's generally going to try to pigeonhole you. And then we try to resist the market putting us in a box, in the pigeonhole. And I'll hear the term, people say, I don't want to be pigeonholed. And I always say, well, the pigeonholes are stuffed with cash. You should be okay with being pigeonholed. I can't really say don't do it as a freelancer, do it when you move to a full studio or a set number of years. You really have to feel your way through this. All I know is in the beginning, your career should, I like to draw it as a kind of a line over time. In the beginning, it's like up, down, really squiggly line, and then it kind of narrows out and focuses over time. You really should be in search of breadth. You want to expose yourself to the changes in the marketplace, the changes in the technology. You might specialize in something today in kind of a discipline or skill set or set of tools that becomes obsolete tomorrow. So you really want to have enough experience of the breadth of the market to get a sense of where the future lies, where a lucrative future lies for you that's not at odds with where things are going. You don't want to be like the person who decides to launch a horse-drawn carriage business right when the motor car is coming into existence. You do have to be cautious.
I'm so interested in this because I kind of believe in specializing a little bit, and I just think it might be in different ways for different people. You know, I have a friend who has built a studio working mostly for like vegan brands and stuff like that. And I think that's an awesome idea because that's obviously quite a new and growing market and stuff like that. But then most people in our industry don't do that. And that's fine too, because maybe they're really good at like a certain piece of software and motion design or something. And I just worry there's a lot of people out there thinking, oh my God, I can only do 2D animation. Should I be a 3D animator as well? And it's kind of like, well, if you're a really good 2D animator and that's how you can get work, like you don't necessarily have to like know all the skills in our industry, you know?
Yeah, but in any industry where technology plays a significant role, you do have to keep an eye on the tech. Motion graphics for vegan brands, that's a really intriguing one. It troubles me a little bit. I think my first reaction is, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then I think, well, what would you know about vegan brands and specifically motion graphics for vegan brands that others who don't specialize in vegan brands would know that would be meaningfully different? And I would struggle to come up with something. So I think the benefit of focusing on vegan brands is you know where to find everybody, right? You know the conferences to go to, the websites, et cetera. It's easier to identify your target market. But when somebody is looking at hiring you versus hiring somebody else, I think you might have a slight competitive advantage, but it's an interesting one. And it just illustrates how tricky this is to carve out a meaningful niche. There is a lot of back and forth on this, like in this online program we're doing now. There are firms in there that I've worked with I used to be a consultant before I turned Win Without Pitching into a training program. I've worked with on a consulting basis or who have been to training programs of ours before where we've covered the subject of positioning, where I thought they were really well positioned and they're back again revisiting their positioning. It's almost like with a lot of firms, it's a never-ending journey, which I never would have expected. I never would have expected that your positioning is something that you're constantly revisiting, but maybe that's just the age that we're living in.
I think just back to the vegan brand thing, I think that's because brands come up, these vegan brands, they're like, oh, I want to work with other vegan brands because they have like a shared value, right?
Yeah,
so like,
that makes sense. Yeah, from that point of view, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I want to get onto pricing a bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about, because I know that you talk about price anchoring a lot, and maybe you can tell us a bit about what that is. But in our industry, a lot of freelancers are charging day rates. So I think it becomes hard for them to double their rate and stuff like that, or even raise their rate, because what we have is people like saying, oh, this is the average rate, blah, blah, blah. And like for a long time, people weren't even saying what the average rates were. But what advice would you give around day rates versus project fees? And do you think it's better to charge a project fee because then you can kind of do some of this price anchoring and that kind of thing?
The first thing I would say is one of the challenges with motion design and all of the aspects of video generally is that for a lot of listeners, your biggest target market is ad agencies. and they're the worst clients. I mean, they're generally speaking, they're my clients, or they make up a decent percentage of our client base. We teach them how to sell. They're horrible, but they commodify everything. So I would not want to be in a position where I had to sell my creative or technical services to an ad agency. My advice constantly to people who do is that's okay for cash flow, but it's not likely you'll build a really profitable business selling to ad agencies because they're so focused on rates and those expenses are being passed on to the client, et cetera, in different ways. So go ahead and continue to serve the agencies, but also try to build a business directly with brands. In those relationships where you're going direct to brands, you're more likely to be able to charge for the project, or even ideally the highest kind of echelon of pricing would be you charge for the value that you create. There's essentially 3 rungs here. There's 3 things that you can price and sell. You can price and sell the inputs of time and materials, or the outputs of the deliverables, which would be a function of inputs or a function of inputs and kind of market value in air quotes. Or you can charge based on the value, like what's this worth to the client? How much value would we create? It's very unlikely that you would value-based price anything when selling to an agency. It's more likely that you would in selling to a client. So an example of charging based on value to a client is they come to you and they want your help creating some videos, maybe creating a YouTube channel, et cetera. And depending on the role that you would be taking in it, you ask the client, what are you trying to accomplish here? What are the goals? How big are you trying to build this audience to? What's that going to mean for your bottom line? If everything goes really well, what does that do to the profitability of the business, et cetera? And you discover that you're in a conversation with somebody who already has a big following, maybe in another kind of medium. And there's maybe they've published a best-selling book, and there's a high degree of certainty that they're going to build a really big channel that's going to drive millions of pounds in new profit. Then you can start to look at saying to the client, well, I could sell you time. I could you could just pay me a day rate, or if you want some price certainty, I could make a big estimate and then give you a price that would be on the higher end of my range of my estimate of how long it would take. If you're really interested in this vision, I'm after hearing you talk about it, I'm really excited about it. If you're interested in me working with you on more of a partnership basis, you could pay me a small amount of money, maybe just to cover my costs, and then pay me based on the success of the channel itself. Is that something you would be interested in? And if the client says, yeah, I'd be really interested in exploring that. Like, the benefit to the client is your incentives are now aligned. You've uncovered somebody who's willing to pay you, not based on time, not based on the deliverable, but based on the outcome, the value that you would help to create. And the benefit to the client is your incentives are aligned. You are effectively business partners here. And if you're willing, in the example I just kind of mimed here, if you're willing to put some compensation at risk, you open the door to extraordinary profit by creating extraordinary value for the client. What I would say to your listener is, even though I've written a book on value-based pricing, it's called Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour. It's an unreasonable expectation that all of your listeners would shift to fully value-based pricing. What I would say is look for those opportunities where the better clients who are actually trying to create something that would be really valuable and create some economic value, where those better clients are really looking for a partner, and they want the incentives, your incentives, to be aligned to their goals. And, if you can get 1 in 5, 1 in 10, that's where you'll make your money, your good money.
I think that's really interesting. I haven't really heard it be explained like that before. And I think for me, then what my mind automatically goes to is okay, cool. So now we've talked about this deal with this YouTuber, but how do we then go about kind of pricing that value-based pricing, I guess, would be my next question.
Yeah. And so the key to success in value-based pricing for creative services is what's known as the value conversation. And the value conversation, you're essentially trying to uncover, how much value might be created. There's 4 steps to the value conversation. I'll give them to you. First step is find out what the client wants. What do you want to be true in the future? Get them to describe their vision of the beautiful vision of the future that they imagine, that they're trying to get to. And they're talking to you about helping them get to this future. So they show up saying, I need some graphics for some videos. they'll state their need is very tactical. And so you just like put that aside for a second and say, okay, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's back up a little bit here. Tell me, like, what is it you're trying to accomplish here? Go out into the future 3-4 years and imagine that you've achieved everything that you want. Describe that to me. What does it look like? Describe your success to me. You uncover what it is that the client wants in the future. And again, you have to kind of transcend the tactical need as they've expressed it. Get them to think big. Get them to share their dream with you. The second step is to identify the metrics of success. So you'd say, okay, this is a really interesting vision. What are the things, like what are the KPIs, as we would say in the business world, the key performance indicators? What are the things that we would measure to prove that you've achieved what you want? Like, what are the quantifiable things? Like 300,000 subscribers to your YouTube channel, 2.5% conversion rate, membership program goes up to this, your book sales go, like whatever the metrics are. Step 1 is what do you want? Step 2 is what will we measure? Step 3 is what's the value? If we hit these metrics, what's the value of this to you? So there's economic value and there's personal value. Let's just keep it to economic at the moment. You add it all up and it turns out somebody can make, well, I might make £1.5 million a year in net new profit. And then step 4 is what would you pay for this? If I could help you get there, if I could help you create this £1.5 million in net new profit, what would you be willing to pay me? So those are the 4 steps, and there's all kinds of nuance that I'm just skipping over and blasting right through. But again, the 4 steps are: find out what the client wants, find out what the metrics of success would be, add up the value of the client getting what they want and hitting these metrics. So what's the value of this? And step 4 is what would they be willing to pay for this? And that's the framework for the value conversation. I just gave it to you. People will go ahead and try it. It's simple, but it's not easy. You want to get better at value-based pricing? Master that value conversation. I believe the framework that I just gave you is the framework for the most valuable skill in all of business. If you can learn to do this well, it will change everything about your business. And the reason is the value conversation represents a 180-degree shift in your thinking. What I mean by that is, if you think about that value conversation, nowhere in there is anything about what you would do or what your costs are. Through the value conversation, you are uncovering what the client wants, the value to be created, and you're setting pricing guidance, even in a broad range of X to Y. The step 4 is to set pricing guidance. You're setting pricing guidance before you have spoken about or thought deeply about the solutions. Every industry that's undergone a pricing revolution, that fundamental shift has happened. The industry has gone from costs first. We'll figure out, well, here's what we would do. Here's how much it would cost us. Now here's how much we need to charge. They flipped that around completely. Instead, said to the client, what do you want? How much value could we create? What would you be willing to pay? And then they start thinking about costs and solutions. That's the fundamental shift that's represented by the value conversation.
That makes complete sense. And I think to me, it's like we've talked about this on the podcast before about how you can come in at more of a like strategy level. And I think that's what we're talking about, isn't it? Rather than like someone who would essentially just, okay, I tell you what to do. This is what you do. You're saying, hey, tell me what you want out of this. Let's talk kind of on a business to business level and then create a solution together.
Yeah, like you imagine somebody comes to you and says, I need some bumpers for these videos or whatever the language is. And the easy thing for you is to say, well, I've got this day rate and it's this much, or we charge X. And the messier thing, but far more valuable to the client, therefore more lucrative for you, thing to do is to say, okay, well, let's tell me about what you're using them for. Okay, let's back up a little bit. Tell me about what you're trying to accomplish. Paint a vision for me of like the success you're trying to create in the larger project. Wow, that sounds really interesting. Again, the easy thing is the client says, I need X. What's your price for X? And you have a rate list and you go, my price for X is Y. It's easier on both sides of the table, but it's not nearly as mutually beneficial.
What I was just thinking about is from when you were talking before, you know, they're like, okay, we've got this YouTuber, they're going to make $1 million a year or something. They're going to build a successful channel. We're probably now going to take them, not just do bumpers. We've decided that we're going to help them with the whole channel, the strategy and everything. But then it's like, okay, but they haven't made that million yet, you know? And I think that's the bit that people will struggle with in their minds, because they're like, well, now I'm just charging them a lot and really promising them something that they haven't achieved, I guess.
So there's pricing based on value, like we're talking about, is a really big category, and there's so many different ways to do it. One end of the spectrum would be if you determine that there's $1.5 million in net new profit here, you would say, okay, well, I'm going to charge you £150,000. It's 10%. And I'm not saying that's the magic number. We just have to pick something here for this discussion. There's no magic number or percentage. You have to work it out. And then the client's taking all the risk in getting there. But the other end of the spectrum would be a contingency payment where you say, I'm going to charge you £150,000, but you don't pay me a penny until we create all of this value, until you have your $1.5 million in net new profit. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. You're going to pay me this money regardless is one end. And the other end of the spectrum is you don't pay me anything until we deliver on this value. And in between those two ends of the spectrum, there's an infinite number of ways that you can propose to get paid. If you put compensation at risk, like the contingency payment, your payoff should be really high. It should be like multiples of any calculation of like time, of selling your time. It would make the maths of selling time just be ridiculous. It would be so high. At the other end of the spectrum, where you're not taking any risk, your ultimate reward would be lower. Part of the reason you get paid a lot is you're making risk go away to the client. And I'm not saying, so let's go back to the YouTuber example. Let's say you look at somebody and you think, wow, this person is really ambitious. I think they're going to do a good job, but they don't have the existing platform. There isn't a lot of proof that says they're going to succeed, but I really believe in them. I really believe in what they're trying to do. I think they can do it. I'm willing to take some risk. And they don't have a lot of money. So you would say, okay, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to propose that you pay me based on results. You're going to pay me a small amount of money so I can cover some of my costs, but I'm essentially going to invest in you. And you're going to pay me a percentage of revenue over time. Or if somebody's trying to build something for the purpose of selling a business, you might say, you're going to give me a percentage of the company, or you're going to give me phantom equity. You're going to give me options in the business, or you're going to pay me based on every 1,000 subscribers that we get to your channel. So you can pick any metric. It can be sales. It can be the sale of the company. It can be the value of the company. It can be the amount of traffic, subscribers in this case. It can be the amount of marketing qualified leads that are generated. There's an infinite number of metrics that you could choose to tie your performance to. If you have a high propensity for risk, you might take on one or even two of these clients where you're taking a lot of risk in the compensation plan, like in how you get paid. And then you would balance that out with all these relationships you have with ad agencies where you're just selling rates, right? You're selling inputs. There's a guy named Ron Baker who's written some very good books on value-based pricing. And he has this great kind of analogy. He says, you should view your client base like you would view your investment portfolio. So even if you don't have an investment portfolio, imagine that in pretty much every jurisdiction in the world, if you're going to work with a financial planner or advisor, they have a regulatory obligation to find out what your risk profile is. So you take this survey. They determine that you have a medium risk profile. What they have to do is they're going to sell you a portfolio of investments. They have this obligation to make sure that the overall portfolio balances out to a medium level of risk so that you can potentially earn some money but still sleep at night. Let's say you had 10 investments in that portfolio. Even though you have a medium risk profile, it doesn't mean that all of those investments should be of medium risk. You would have some low risk investments and some high risk investments and some middle ones. They have to balance out so that overall the portfolio is just of medium risk. Now you think of your client base the same way. You would have low risk clients. These are the ones where you're selling time. You're not going to get rich from them, but it's cash flow. It lets you sleep at night. And you might have room for one or even two, or maybe some of you 3 high risk clients where you are proposing to get paid based on the value that you create, and you're putting some compensation at risk.
That's great. I think this is going to blow some people's minds and be like, yeah, that's really cool. Because I think most of us would quite like the idea of, being more partners with people and working in this way, because, you get ultimately, if it's something that you're passionate about, you get more out of it. And I could even see a potential in our industry that, you know, some of these clients that you could work with, if they don't start off with a lot of money and stuff like that, but you want to help them, maybe they're like a startup company or something, then that could kind of replace your personal projects in a way, because you could potentially negotiate, like, I'm going to have a bit more creative freedom as well because of this, like how we're working together and things like that. Do you think that could possibly be a thing as well?
It's a great way to think about it. I've never thought about it that way. Like the personal projects that you do that are, it's not so much for the money, it's for the creativity. That's a great way to think about it. The biggest mistake when it comes to pricing is thinking that there's one right way to price. So again, you take this portfolio approach and think of it as risk. Selling time is low risk. Selling value and putting compensation is high risk. And look for, startups. You come across this cool startup who can't afford you. If business is okay and the money's coming in and you can afford to invest some time, you might say, you know what, this is going to be my one high risk investment. I'm going to work for free on this and you're going to pay me. And when we hit these goals, you're going to pay me a lot of money. We've had clients who've earned millions of dollars, and I know of other firms that have earned tens of millions of dollars, and over the years, hundreds of millions of dollars, in just being really creative in how they price and looking for the opportunities to get paid based on some really big metrics, like ultimately the sale of the company. We have a client who was in a workshop last year who left the workshop, immediately structured a deal, and within a year, the company was sold and he netted high six figures. And this is a very small firm of, I think it's 3 people. The opportunities are out there. Pricing is mental prison in that we think we're locked into this price band. We think the market, there's only one way to charge and in a very narrow band, but that's not the case at all. We're just not thinking about it creatively enough. Pricing really is a creative act. So get creative. Just like every engagement should be this bespoke engagement, every proposal should be bespoke, every price should be bespoke. It should be a creative act.
I think that's awesome. Like, talking about this stuff makes me really excited because I think of myself as an entrepreneur and I'm like, yeah, if I was like doing more motion design work right now, I'd be trying to do this, trying to make different deals with people, because I think it's exciting. And I hope that some people listening are as excited as I am about it, because I think it's really like a cool idea to kind of look at it in this different way. And I haven't really heard many people talking about stuff like this before. So I think it's awesome. One more question that I want to ask you, like before we wrap this up, because I know that we're talking a lot about expertise and fit and stuff like that earlier on in the podcast, and a lot of people find it hard. I think if you're trying to do this stuff where you're talking to clients and getting to know them and like, why are you doing this project? Why do you want these bumpers? Why do you want this animation? That kind of thing. In your book, I think that you said that if it's not a right fit, you should say it's not a right fit and maybe recommend someone else and things like that. That is like a hard thing for people to do. So I wondered if you had any advice for everyone on how to say no to people, and especially like times like this where we're not really sure what's happening in the world and everyone's like fearing another recession and that kind of thing. Like, what would your advice be to kind of stick into your guns in that aspect of things?
It's difficult times, right? There will be times in your business, especially early on, especially as a freelancer, where every dollar is a good dollar. If you're following my kind of earlier advice of say yes to everything, there's not a lot that you would say no to. It's not until you become this specialized expert. You'll know you're an expert when somebody comes to you and says, hey, can I hire you to do X? And you look at X and you think, I've never done X before. And you realize your reaction is, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to step outside my comfort zone. Because in the early days of your business, when you're this broad generalist, pretty much everything is outside of your comfort zone. Therefore, nothing is, if that makes sense. You're doing everything, almost everything for the first time, but you have this kind of like enthusiasm to learn everything. So you don't have this like fear of, oh, I wouldn't know what the patterns are. I wouldn't know. It would take me a long time to learn how to do this. you'll have this mental shift over time as you narrow your focus and you become the specialized expert, and you're invited to step outside of your area of expertise. You'll realize, yeah, I don't want to do that. I'm so used to being the expert, to seeing the patterns, to knowing what the problems are, to knowing what to do. The idea of like stepping into a room or a world where it's like, I don't understand the patterns, it will not appeal to you. But as long as you're a generalist, you'll never have that fear. Like, it wouldn't even occur to you. Your reaction is, oh, I've never done that before. This will be cool. That's the reaction of a generalist or somebody who's young and learning. And it's a perfectly valid reaction if you're young and learning. And then you want to get to this place where it's like, yeah, I don't like, you'll know this is not something that you should be doing. This client would be better served by somebody else. The way you broaden your expertise once you are an expert is your good clients with whom you have an ongoing relationship. So you're doing X for them, a discipline that is in your sweet spot. They're hiring you for that. And then they come to you one day and say, hey, would you also do Y for us? Like something tangentially related, but you've never done before. And you get that little uncomfortable feeling. But because you have this great relationship with your client, you would say, well, I'm kind of interested in it because for whatever reason, it might be the future. But you need to know I've never done this before. So if you're willing to just, that's the caveat. You understand that. I'm willing to do it if you're willing to hire me for it, but you need to know I've never done it before. And the client might say, yeah, it's fine. I trust you. I think you can figure it out. That's how you broaden your expertise once you are an expert. It's through the good relationships with the good clients. And you have this honest conversation about, yeah, I've never done this before. And they say, that's okay. I trust you. Early on, you're kind of faking it, hoping the client doesn't ask, have you ever done this before? Because all experience is good experience and every pound is a good pound.
What I got out of this conversation the most is that it's not always like one way. I think that when we speak to each other and we hear like people doing YouTube videos about all of this different stuff, like we tend to like see one thing and we're like, okay, now everybody has to do that, or now everyone has to do this, Yeah. And I like the different options and stuff like that. And I think that's really, really cool. And I think it's going to help a lot of people change their mindset, but also know that they don't have to like jump into something completely different straight away. Maybe they can dip their toes into different things.
Can I offer your audience one last piece of like parting advice?
That would be great, yeah.
If you're in the motion graphics business, you should think about being the client. So we think, okay, I have this scale. I'm going to sell this scale on a fee-for-service basis. There's so much, video is so big right now, as we all know, right? And there's no sign of that ever changing. It might occur to you at some point that you're on the wrong side of the buy-sell divide. People are buying your services for cheap, and they're using them to make a lot of money. You, as an entrepreneur, you probably have some ideas about, oh, well, what if I did a YouTube channel on this, or a product on this, or a training product, or something else? Could you take your skills and build a product that you could sell yourself, whether the product is a channel or whatever it is? And many of your listeners would know of Chris Do in the future. I think Chris is a great example of he ran a studio called Blind. In fact, he still might. I'm not professing. I know Chris, but I'm not professing to have any inside knowledge about either of his businesses really. And that's a super competitive business. But then he's basically taken his clearly immense skills in the video production business, and he's made himself the product, and he's used his skills to build a product, the future that he owns. And I think if you're in the video space, whether it's motion graphics or you're a shooter or whatever it is, you should think about that shift. I'm not saying you should do it. I'm saying you should think about it. You should open your eyes to the possibility that more creative and opportunities, the more lucrative opportunities might actually be in using those skills to build a product that you own or a different type of business.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it is happening in our industry. I think it's just very slowly. Like there's a lot more, people getting into teaching and YouTube channels, and it's definitely not for everyone. But I think we've had like a couple of podcasts about making a YouTube channel to kind of build your motion design career and stuff like that. So I think it is definitely interesting. And obviously I'm talking to you now on this podcast, and this has like changed my whole career. So I always recommend people think about this stuff. So I definitely think it's a good point. And I think what I would like to see in the industry, what I think is interesting is us making our own animations in some way that could be like on a YouTube channel or something about like teaching people, but through animation or something like that. That's not really something I've seen loads of. There are a few channels, but yeah, that kind of thing I think could be really, really interesting. So we're kind of still making the animation, but we're building an audience with it instead of selling it to other people to, sell products essentially.
We do have to be aware of YouTube, though. Like there is this, it commodifies everything, right? It's like stuff that you used to pay for, people are giving away for free now. So I would, the idea of you build a YouTube channel by giving away all of your stuff for free. It works if you're building kind of capabilities among a market. But if the capabilities mean they never have to hire you and you're not monetizing that channel in some way, you might be going too far at giving too much away. As a matter of lead gen, if you're in the motion graphics business, you should probably be using video as a way to build credibility and drive, create some interest, drive some traffic.
Yeah, and I talked to someone else called Philip Van Dusen recently a lot about this as well in the podcast. So if anyone's listening and wants to know more and more about that, they can listen to that one too, because I know that we're running out of time. But do you want to tell the audience where they can find you and maybe some of their books if they want to read more about this?
Sure. So you can find me at winwithoutpitching.com. I'm Blair Enns on Twitter and LinkedIn. My book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, is available on Amazon. And my most recent book, Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour, is available only at pricingcreativity.com. It's available in multiple different formats at multiple different prices. I think it's the only pricing book in the world priced based on the principles in the book. So it's very expensive, but it comes with the full money back guarantee if you don't get value out of it.
Yeah, and I think it's awesome. I think people should just go and look at that, just to look at the pricing structure you've done, and you get a better understanding of, where you're coming from. I think it's really interesting.
It's so much fun selling, and pricing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really awesome.
It's been my pleasure, Haley. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks again to Blair for coming on the show. That was a really awesome episode. Definitely go and check out his books, Win Without Pitching and Pricing Creativity. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do consider sharing it on Twitter or Instagram. You can tag us. We are at Motion Hatch. I'd love to know what you thought of it. And thank you again for listening. I hope that you have a wonderful week. See ya.